Voice is breaking a little.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to the second talk of this session. Before we begin, I would like to extend our heartfelt condolences on behalf of the History Department and the Seminar Committee to the family of our fellow MPhil student, Jauddin, who unfortunately passed away last week after a long and spirited battle with intestinal tuberculosis. Let us observe 1 minute of silence in his fond memory. We pray that his family can find strength to get through this tough time and expect that more of us come forward and contribute, however little, to help them financially in their hour of crisis. The details of the fundraiser can be accessed through the seminar committee. I now formally welcome you all to today's talk by Professor Anirudh Deshpande, Professor, Department of History, Delhi University, on the topic, Their Words and Our Meanings, Anachronism and Maratha History. Professor Deshpande has authored, edited, and co-edited several books, including The British Raj and its Indian Armed Forces, British Military Policy in India, 1900 to 1945, Colonial Constraints in Declining Power, Class, Power, and Consciousness in Indian Cinema and Television, The First Line of Defense, Glorious 50 Years of the Border Security Force BSF, Hope and Despair, Mutiny, Rebellion, and Death in India, The Practice of History, Essays in Search of a New Past, and The Rise and Fall of a Brown Water Navy, Sarkhel, Kanhoji, Angre, and Maratha Sea Power on the Arabian Sea in the 17th and the 18th centuries. He is also the author of numerous research papers, articles, reviews, and encyclopedia entries. He also writes fiction in English and Hindi. He is an alumnus of St. Stephen's College and JNU, and has been a fellow at NMML, Teen Murti, and ICHR. He was ICCR guest professor at Vienna University in 2014-2015 and visiting professor North Bengal University in November 2015. Professor Yasser Arafat will chair this talk. Over to you, Professor Arafat.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Okay, one second. Good afternoon, everyone. And I thank the seminar committee for inviting me to chair this session today. As it was mentioned in the introductory brief, Professor Anirudh is one of the foremost authorities on Maratha history.
Yes, sir, you're unclear. You're speaking very, I think you're speaking very softly. I can't hear you properly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. As it was mentioned in the introductory brief, Professor Anirudh Deshpande is one of the foremost and finest authorities on Maratha history. And I'm very happy to be part of this session. He's going to deal with one of the most debated and contested part of our historiography and everyday narratives. Like all of you, I'm eagerly waiting for his thoughts on the topic, the curious title, Their Words and Our Meanings, Anachronism and Maratha History. And I hope he will warm us with his invigorating ideas and intellectual provocations. Thank you once again. Over to you, Anirudh.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind words, Yasser. It's always nice to see you. and also hear you talk, especially when you talk about me. So I'm not going to waste too much time on niceties and so on. I think this was a paper written a few months ago for a journal, and I still consider it a draft. It's an ongoing process. It's basically a paper which is still in the process of being written and finalized for a future, as a future chapter in one of the books I have planned to write again this year, which will be on basically on critical essays on Maratha history and historiography. So comments on my paper will be most welcome. Observations and comments on my paper will be most welcome. So I won't waste too much time. I'll straight away launch into the paper and speak about, what I have to say, basically. There's a particular article by Carlo Ginzburg in which he warns the historian against practicing ventriloquism. And anachronism is a kind of ventriloquism, when you make the sources speak in your language. The Webster's dictionary defines anachronism as, quote unquote, a chronological misplacing of persons, events, objects, or customs in regard to each other, and a person or a thing that is chronologically out of place, especially from a former age, that is incongruous in the present. So basically, the incongruity of the past and the present is a serious problem of historiography, because anachronism in history writing often results from ideology permeating the historian's imagination. Now, we may argue that ideology is omnipresent in the historian's imagination and consciously or subconsciously infiltrates it, but this caveat need not detain us here. As a linguistic condition created by the vocabulary of the present, ideology sometimes erects a psychological barrier between the historian and his sources. This essential problem of conceiving the past and writing history was grasped, among others, by the historian Louis Nehemiah, who warned us that man clogs the free play of his mind with political doctrine and dogma. So we ask, can a historian unclog his mind and think of the past in its own terms? A historian like Leopold von Ranke would have answered this with a nonchalance we can ill afford in our peculiar circumstances. Perhaps the historian must try to unclog his mind. Although, as Carr puts it, the past is intelligible to us only in the light of the present, and we can fully understand the present only in the light of the past. The problem of understanding the past in the quote-unquote light of the present, including, of course, in the language of the present, has exercised the historian's minds ever since history became a modern scientific discipline. There are observations on this methodological problem in the works of Mark Bloch. For example, the historian's craft says that a good half of all we see is seen through the eyes of others. This includes what is read and heard today and the sources of history produced by past observers of events. Bloch's telling comment raises the fundamental question of treating history as a credible modern discipline. And language complicates the issue further. Over time, as the master wrote, the meaning of words with same spellings change. To the great despair of historians, men fail to change their vocabulary every time they change their customs. Now, these are words of Mark Bloch. Thus, words like benefice, fief, and villain meant different things in different temporal and social contexts. So how do we interpret the past? According to Bloch, a historical phenomenon can never be understood apart from its moment in time. This is true of every evolutionary stage, our own and all others. To some, this may seem like a vindication of 19th century positivism and warm the cockles of a postmodernist or radical partisan. But that, however, is not the point, because Bloch, after all, would hardly have advocated history's return to positivism. The French pioneer only wanted history to renounce its archangelic airs, because an understanding of the people is the aim of purposeful history. By understanding people who inhabited the past, Bloch introspected, perhaps the conflicts of the present can be avoided. In simple words, therefore, judging the past can produce drastic political consequences, only too obvious in the age of sectarian conflicts in which we, the moderns, find ourselves living. Since the solution lies in a problem correctly stated, the past can be understood only if the historian becomes self-reflexive and alert to the anachronisms of the present in which he reconstructs history. Carlo Ginzburg reiterates the dilemma further. Historians start from questions using terms that are inevitably anachronistic, he declares. An honest historian would modify his language as his research progresses from the general, which conditions his vocabulary, to the particular and back. In the process, written history and the historian both are transformed, and a synthesis evolves to another level. The fruit of such meticulous labor ripens over years spent in libraries, archives, and the field. In sum, the dilemma created by modern language in which we conceptualize the past is solved only if the tension between our questions and the answers we get from the evidence is kept alive, as Ginzburg has put it. Ginzburg concludes the argument. If the difference between our words and theirs is carefully preserved, it will prevent us from falling into two traps: empathy and ventriloquism. So in either case, the understanding of which Bloch wrote will elude us. After all, the historian, like his human subject, is a social being whose thoughts are conditioned by languages constructed by powers over which he has little control. Language as a dynamic entity evolves in dialectics with the state and society. It is influenced by social revolutions and technological change. Words travel over time and geographical distances, hybridizing languages. Critical historians assert that the Industrial Revolution transformed the meaning of several words in the 19th century, creating linguistic meanings specific to the modern world. The transition from feudalism to capitalism and to industrial capitalism transformed European languages in numerous ways between 1450 and 1850. A forceful Marxist argument asserting this hypothesis is presented by Raymond Williams in his path-breaking work, Culture and Society, Coleridge to Orwell. Williams, in this very important book, mentions 5 key words which underwent a change in meaning and transformed the modern understanding of society in the 19th and 20th centuries. And these 5 words are industry, democracy, class, art, and culture. If we add nation to these words, reading inter alia Benedict Anderson and Terry Eagleton, a new imagination of the past, we conclude, emerged worldwide in the 19th century. This imagination was romantic, hegemonic, or counter-hegemonic, depending upon the circumstances in which it arose. The nation, a new concept popularized by the nationalist literates who monopolized print capitalism in the 19th century, spawned words in which the past was increasingly written in the 19th and 20th centuries. Hobsbawm explains why and how literacy prepared the ground for the emergence of quote-unquote national languages in the late 19th century. Nationalism created the nation in the imagination of men affected by class struggle. Influenced by the French Revolution, it predated the wars of the liberator Simon Bolivar. Print capitalism assisted the process by creating imagined communities. The rise and spread of print capitalism as a corollary of the capitalist mode of production was crucial to the transition from state to nation state in the period marked by the rise of the modern West in world history, which is a period between 1500 and 1900 AD. In India, the transformation of print languages was wrought by British colonialism in the 19th century with salutary consequences. Although the printing press was started in Goa by the Portuguese in 1556, it remained unimportant to the medieval Indian polities in which literacy levels were abysmal. The ruling and trading groups could get along without printing what they wrote because it was unnecessary for them to educate the mass of working people. Therefore, literate medieval Indians wrote documents. Those which survived were mostly published after 1800 AD. The absence of a bourgeoisie in medieval India postponed India's print revolution. British colonialism imported the technology of print capitalism and the language of quote-unquote civilization which had evolved in bourgeois Europe into India, creating a new vocabulary in which the educated Indian began to imagine history. This had serious consequences for the development of modern political consciousness among the various sections of Indians. The more the colonialists denied that India was a nation and could survive united only under British rule, the greater was the vehemence of the nationalists to the contrary. After 1857, due to the growth of universities, Indian nationalism and regional patriotism, the vocabulary of historiography changed. In fact, I would say it was transformed. In consequence, the difference which Ginsberg underlines between the words of the pre-colonial writers and the modern colonialist and nationalist writers was obliterated by the contest of ideologies. Indian history became hostage to colonialism, nationalism, communalism, and caste consciousness. Bloch and Ginsberg suggest a critical reading of authentic primary sources as a way by which the historian can maintain a healthy distance between ideology and his craft. Allegorically speaking, scientific history makes the historian a detective who arrives at the crime scene to reconstruct it by analyzing the evidence at his disposal meticulously. Like a surgeon, he must sterilize his implements, as Ginsberg warns us. An opinionated detective will prove unequal to the task. A critique of historiography is part of the historian's armory because sources are often misinterpreted by excited historians. The vocabulary of writers who lived centuries ago hide the key to a scientific reconstruction of the past. As Paul Thompson puts it, the past speaks in many voices, which we must listen, not only hear, but listen carefully. We can write our story only after that. This does not mean that the historian is value-free. It only means that a good historian comprehends the difference between his values and the fruits of his own diligence. Far too often, revolutions happen in the historian's minds long before they are witnessed in history. Now, this brings me to the second part of my talk, which is about the vocabulary of primary sources. We all know that words cause confusion. Let's take one word, for example, zamindar. Zamindar, for example, perplexes the Indian student of history and foreigner alike. It means one thing in Mughal India and quite another in the agrarian Bengal fashioned by British revenue policy. While it referred to the class of large upper caste absentee landlords created by Cornwallis in the 19th century in Bengal, it signified a peasant proprietor in the areas which eventually became Uttar Pradesh, as also Punjab during the colonial period. Sometimes the words zamindar and jagirdar are used interchangeably, confounding matters more. Comparatively speaking, what would the words mean now? The Hindi word kisan denotes a peasant proprietor, but is used to describe the peasantry en masse, as the overwhelming majority of whom are poor and marginal farmers. A marginal peasant who works as a farm hand to supplement his meager income becomes a mazdoor. Below, I focus on, after this, I focus on Desh, loosely translated into English as country, or the Urdu mulk, to illustrate the point further. The phrase Desh Bhakti comes from Desh and not Rashtra. It could mean love of the country. In medieval times, Desh denoted in general a patria. The meaning of patria, the root of patriotism, is natural habitat. A patriot may or may not be a nationalist. The armed rebels of 1857 who swarmed Delhi were patriots. The later Tagore, a good example, remained patriotic but became a critic of nationalism, which produced fascism, Nazism, and militarism between 1920 and 1940. In modern Hindi and Marathi, nation is Rashtra. Used for the English nation, it is absent from the pre-colonial primary sources. Even the nomenclature Maharashtra, derived from the ancient Apabhransha Maharashtri, or the word Maharathi, meaning a great warrior worthy of grants and remembrance, is missing from these primary sources, which belong to the 18th century. So the Marathas, who emerged from the peasant Kunbis, were people who spoke variants of Marathi, some of which are still spoken by castes not identified as Maratha. Extant literature on the subject suggests that the hybrid vocabularies of castes like the Pardhis, Mangs, or Ramoshis are different from the lexicons produced by a state-guided formal education. The standard school Marathi, like other state languages, is a comparatively new product of politics. Ancient texts refer to contemporary Maharashtra as Dakshinapath or even Dandakaranya. The English Deccan is the Sanskrit Dakshin, which meant a geographically spread area south of the Vindhyas. Here, people sometimes refer to themselves as the Dakhanis, a generic word. And that is how Ahmad Shah Abdali identified the vanquished of 1761 in a letter to the Raja of Jaipur. Further, in his eyewitness account of the Third Battle of Panipat, Kashiraj Pandit, the Mutsaddi and Vakil of Shujauddaulah, uses the same word for the ones from south of the Narmada as well as himself. There is no mention of Maharashtra in his interesting text, and the language in which Sadashiv Rao wrote him a letter brought to him by Bhavani Shankar Pandit, a fellow Deshast from Aurangabad, is described as Dakkani. The claims to origins also are always diverse and contested. One regimental history of the Mahar regiment, raised in 1941 after a great struggle against upper caste discrimination waged by the Mahar recruits of the Maratha Light Infantry, claims that the word Maharashtra is derived from the word Mahar, as in the Mahar caste. That means the original home of the Mahars. The Mahars are described as the original aboriginal inhabitants of the region suppressed for centuries by Aryan outsiders. Many important primary sources of Maratha history do not contain terms imposed on Maratha history by nationalism. The words Desh and Muluk are especially chosen as examples here. These appear in significant primary sources like the Bhausahebanchi Bakhar, Holkaranchi Thaili, Panipachi Bakhar, the Atma Charitra of Nana Fadnavis, and the numerous copious letters written by the prolific letter writer Antaji Mankeshwar, the Peshwa's garrison commander in Delhi in mid-18th century. Also noteworthy is the fact that these and other primary sources were edited and published by nationalist scholars who probably subconsciously assumed a congruence between their and the sources' meanings of these words. But these were honest men, not given to mischief, much in evidence on the WhatsApp histories in circulation these days. The words which describe what the nationalists called Maharashtra are different in the Agnya Patra, written by a surviving minister of Shivaji, Ramachandra Pant Amatya Bavdekar, at the behest of Shivaji's grandson Shambhaji, the son of Rajaram, around 1714. Now, Ramachandra Amatya was a member of the Ashtapradhan, the cabinet of Shivaji, and he was the last surviving member of this cabinet. The Agnya Patra, commissioned work, called an example of Shiv-Kalin Marathi prose, was influenced by the Mahabharata, Arthashastra, and Shukra Niti Sar. In this didactic text, Bavdekar chooses the following words: Sarva Dakshin Desh, all southern country; Dakshin Prant, southern province; Prant, Muluk, Mulk; Par Muluk, Mulk outside the Raj. These words refer to the south between the Narmada and Rameshwar, seemingly united in a single state by the great Shivaji. This prescriptive text advised statecraft to a young king in a context removed from the national past imagined by historians later. Agnya Patra is supposedly about the ideal kingship practiced and inspired by Shivaji. Written to glorify Marathi Shahi, it does little to justify the communal twist of Maratha history. There is Desh, Raja, and the undifferentiated Praja in it, but no nation, that is Rashtra. Similarly, Nana Fadnavis's Atma Charitra deploys Desh for the land south of the Narmada, called Maharashtra today, and eschews the descriptive categories found in modern normative histories. The Battle of Panipat too finds mention in a para or two in this Charitra by an eyewitness who survived the battle. More sources square with the impossibility of the transformation of patria into nation before the emergence of nationalism. Letters by Antaji Mankeshwar to Pune during the high noon of Peshwai refer to the Marathi patria as Desh repeatedly. Antaji refers to a variety of subjects: travel, pilgrimages, revenue collections, settlement of accounts, and the troop strength, and so on. The movement of people to and from the Desh is mentioned, but the word Maharashtra does not occur. The sources separate the Desh from Hindustan with reference to the Narmada, but precious little is said on a possible boundary between Desh Dakhan and the deep south. This creates a major hiatus between normative and substantive histories of the peninsula. Jinji and Tanjore were Maratha riyasats, and Karnataka had a substantial Marathi presence. But were they outposts or parts of the Desh? We don't, and perhaps will never know. So we have to keep these things in mind, and we have to actually look at the sources very carefully with these things in mind when we start writing not only Maratha history, but the history of other Indian regions as well. So, let me conclude the argument before we start the process of discussing these things and asking questions and answers. The argument against reading Maratha history in religious terms, as communal historians do, is quite old. It's not a new argument. For instance, the nationalist historian T.S. Shejwalkar, who wrote Panipat in 1946 as an apology for the much maligned Sadashiv Rao Bhau, who was the de facto Brahmin commander of the Marathas at Panipat in 1761, summed up the entire issue of communalizing the battle in the following words. Let me quote him. "It is unhistorical, therefore, to call the Battle of Panipat a Hindu-Muslim fight. Verily, religion is the last resort of scoundrels," unquote. And parochialism can safely be added to this qualification. Communal and nationalist interpretations of history impose normative standards on India's pre-colonial past in a country obsessed with nationalism. These interpretations ignore the significant transformations of Indian memory and history brought about by British colonialism in India during the 19th century. Further, the nationalist and communal interpretations appear problematic in the context of the language deployed by the pre-colonial chroniclers, blissfully ignorant of colonialism and nationalism in the service of social memory. Let us remember that these men did not write a prose designed to justify the fantasies of future historians. So what I have tried to do is hopefully to show that linguistic meanings of a source can be transformed into convenient concepts by the historians at the altar of ideology. The historian in search of religious or political binaries reads the sources with a blinkered vision, misses the multifarious social and economic richness of the past, and cultivates an unsympathetic attitude towards a time far removed from the age of modernity. In sum, he allows his political motives to impinge on the past uncritically. For the critical historian aware of his bias, the way out of this ideological pedagogical conundrum lies in reading the primary sources of history carefully with pencil and paper in hand and underlining the difference between the vocabulary of our ancestors and ourselves. This is painstaking work, usually impossible to achieve over weekends. The answer to the imposition of normative criteria on history is not a counter-normative offensive, as is generally the case with polemical history writing, but a consciously cultivated distance between our normative preferences and their historical realities. Marshalling the technology of the historian's craft and putting it at the service of microhistory is one way of steering clear of an absorption of history into ideology. This can only be attempted and possibly accomplished by a historian willing to subject his sources to psychological, sociological, and political scrutiny. By doing so, as Bloch, E.H. Carr, or Ginsberg suggest, the historian can create a new synthesis between the micro and macro histories only after years of sustained and disciplined intellectual and physical labor. It must be remembered that language is both bane and solution to the historian in search of an authentic past, and none could have expressed this better than Mark Bloch, whom I quote. Unlike mathematics or chemistry, he says, our science has at its disposal no system of symbols unconnected with national language. The historian speaks only with words, hence with those of his country. If he finds realities expressed in a foreign language, he must translate. As for that, there is no serious obstacle as long as the words refer to commonplace things or actions. That ready money of the vocabulary is easily exchanged at par. On the other hand, as soon as those institutions, beliefs, and customs which play a profounder part in the peculiar life of a society make their appearance, the translation into another language made after the likeness of a different society becomes an enterprise fraught with dangers. For to choose an equivalent is to postulate a resemblance. So, to conclude, the sources, especially the pre-colonial sources, 18th century, 17th century, 16th century, these sources speak to us of an unfamiliar land and people. Maybe a trace of those people survives in us and might possibly outlive our generation. Nonetheless, the social and therefore political difference between people who conducted the business of their lives in a land 300 or 400 years ago and ourselves is enormous. The problem of writing the history of pre-modern people is acute because the Industrial Revolution created a society in which the meaning of words was transformed irrevocably. In India, the early 18th century society was not very different from the late 18th century society. However, the late 19th century society was different in many ways from the late 18th century society. In general, therefore, the material and ideological life in the past was qualitatively different from today's nuclear and internet age. If our ancestors conversed in words different from the ones we use for our life purposes today, we must try and understand them in their pre-modern context. Wrenching words out of their context and imparting our meanings to them is to write convenient but dishonest history. A commitment to dishonest history is nothing but the propagation of political mischief. On the other hand, our ancestors may have used some words familiar to us, but with different meanings. For instance, they wrote of a desh, mulk, or watan, unlike the way a nationalist demagogue or a poet speaks them. Whether words change or remain the same, the treatment of language is beyond the capabilities of weekend historians who crowd the media these days. So in sum, when we look at the sources, when we look at the primary sources, as Ginsberg says, in fact, Ginsberg goes so far as to say in his advocacy of microhistory, that if you really want to write an authentic, critical microhistory of the past, in the context of the larger structures which inform this microhistory, sometimes it is best not to read secondary sources before you start attempting to analyze primary sources. And it seems he's saying that it is better to keep and maintain a distance from the secondary sources for a little while before attempting to analyze the primary sources on their own, because history comes to us through layers, filtered layers through secondary sources. All historians keep adding to these sources, keep adding meanings and different meanings, changed meanings, their own ideological meanings to these sources in their narratives. And it is important for the young researcher, and in fact, not only the young researcher, I would say it is important for all researchers to be acutely conscious of these meanings added to these sources. These sources which have been preserved in layers of historiography, which we need to peel one after the other to reach the sources and look at them afresh in search of newer, critical microhistories. And that is how we can write history with a difference being maintained between overtly ideological histories and histories written in a way in which the historian becomes conscious of his bias, his prejudices, and tries his best to keep his biases and prejudices away from his own prose as he keeps looking at the sources, keeps writing them, and keeps changing his prose in the light of the sources which he looks at. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Professor Arafat, would you like to make comments?
Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Okay. Thank you, Anirudh. Yeah, it was really tantalizing, and it was also extremely rich with a really strong theoretical framework. And of course I'm really happy that you have cleared some of the perpetual confusions prevalent in our mind. So in my understanding, the fundamental question Professor Deshpande was asking or has asked is, how far can we go back? to find out the terminologies, concepts, and ideas that we think existed from time immemorial. For example, did concepts like Rashtra, Desh, Deshbhakt, even the idea of Maharashtra exist the way they exist today? So these kind of questions need to be asked again and again when the emotive canvas of people all over the world, and of course in India, are manipulated through invention, reinvention, and also erasure of history and our past. So I would like to say that I'm in a complete agreement with you, Anirudh, when it comes to the question of anachronism. Because surely anachronism cannot be a methodology itself. So, but when it comes to the question of analogy, when it comes to the question of Maratha sources, the primary sources, as you say, particularly from, say, the 17th century and 18th century, how do we understand the analogical texts, texts like, say, Kavindra Paramananda's text, Shiva Bharat kind of text. And how do we understand the kind of analogy? Analogy is a tool of subversion coming from the regional writers, because you find lots of analogical categories. For example, the idea of Asura, when they talk about the conflicts between the Mughals and the Marathas. So how do we understand that kind of a analogical situation, and how cautious historians should be when we use those kind of categorization by the scholars of the period? So that is one question I begin with, and of course, I hope other participants will have a lot of questions as well. So yeah, Anirudh, thank you once again. So yeah.
Yeah, sir, thanks for raising this question. Am I audible?
Yeah, to me, yes.
There's a problem with this jack, so I have to ask that sometimes. The first thing which, as I have pointed out in this, terse presentation, actually I could have gone on with the aid of many more examples from the sources which I have seen and which I have read in Marathi and sometimes in English as well. But there's no point in belaboring the point beyond a certain point, you see. The first thing which we have to be very conscious of, as I've pointed out in my presentation, is the colonial interregnum. So most of the categories with which we see our past have been provided to us by colonialism and nationalism and communalism, and of course the caste perspectives also. One can analyze various perspectives on Shivaji, for instance, to arrive at a very critical understanding of these interpretations. Just because one contests the communal interpretation of Shivaji or the nationalist interpretation of Shivaji or the colonial interpretation of Shivaji does not mean that one automatically agrees with the caste interpretations of Shivaji. So, of course, one has to be acutely aware of historiography in general. And after you've become very, very consciously, you become conscious of these categories within which we've been taught to conceive history since we've been children, through comics and through books and through textbooks, through classroom lectures, and the various, various books which we keep reading, and the media, of course, which plays its role increasingly it has played a very important role in the last 25, 30 years, especially the social media and so on. And the debates which keep going on between these what Professor D.N. Jha used to call in the category of the tribe of weekend historians who keep crowding the media and keep cluttering your mind with ideas and concepts. And you keep replying to them, and sometimes you also become polemical in contesting certain positions for politically strategic and tactical reasons. One is, this happened with the case of Subhash Chandra Bose over the last 3-4 days in the media, and there were lots of articles and people took all sorts of positions and so on. But the serious historian will, put his head down, as Ginsburg advises him to do so, and take pen and paper, take a very sharp pencil, and take a magnifying glass, metaphorically speaking, and really interact with the source very carefully and read between the lines. It is that familiarity with the literary richness of the source. See, the source is not only a source of material history. The source is not only a historical source. I think the sources, the pre-colonial sources, which are written with this, which are not written with the consciousness which the scribe might have had of writing modern history. Of course, you find, you find that Bhausaheb Anchi Bakar, for instance, is written by a scribe who was very sympathetic to the Shindes. You can make out. It is not that it's not as if these are objective accounts. These are also literary texts which have inbuilt subjectivities in them, for instance. But if you take the texts as an entire corpus, let's say corpus produced, let's say between 1750s and 1780s, let's say, apparently Kashiraj Pandit's account of the eyewitness account of the Battle of Panipat was written in the 1780s when he was an old man, and unfortunately the Persian the original Persian text which he wrote is not to be found. It is found only in translations now, and I actually got a copy thanks to a friend of mine. With great difficulty, I had been actually looking for this text for a very long time, because I wanted to see the Battle of Panipat from the perspective of the Waqil and Mutsaddi of Shujauddaulah. So this is the North Indian perspective, written by a Deshastha Brahman who is from the Desh, who is settled in North India, and whose account is dismissed by Shejwalkar, because Shejwalkar says that we can't trust Kashiraj Pandit simply because Kashiraj Pandit was a Deshastha Brahman who had settled in the North India and acquired the mannerisms of a Kayasth. And Shejwalkar is Shejwalkar, I think, was a Karade Brahman. So he, his one-point program in the book is to defend Sadashiv Rao, which he does with a certain capability, which you must understand. He was a very capable historian. And he very clearly, although he's a nationalist, he's quite a Marathi sort of nationalist, but he is very clear that it cannot be looked at in the communal way. So I can only say, what I have read in Ginsburg or Mark Bloch or Eric Hobsbawm or other authors, or Greenblatt or Eagleton and so on, or Raymond Williams and so on, that one is still familiar with the colonial past in certain ways, because from the colonial period, at least from the 1840s, 50s, a kind of society which we are today was coming into being. So we are in familiar waters in some ways. The cities, the urban landscapes, lots of things are similar between, let's say, 1870s, 80s, and to the today's world in which we live, because we owe a lot of this world to the colonial past. It's part of the same continuums, part of the same episteme in many ways. But the world before 1800, especially the world before 1780s, 1770s, I think to the modern Indian, that world in some ways is a foreign world. It's almost like going to a foreign country where people are different, they think differently because their mind is not contaminated by the categories created by colonialism and the nationalist reaction to colonialism. So many of the concepts, many of the categories, many of the words, in fact, the vocabulary of conceptualizing and writing history which comes into the modern Indian's mind from the 1860s, 70s, 80s onwards, that vocabulary is absent from these literary texts, from these historical sources produced in the 18th century. And I think when you become acutely conscious of this particular difference, it's then that you start really enjoying reading these sources and appreciating the multifarious richness which these sources actually contain. And actually how much, and then you come to know how much you can get from these sources, and how illuminated your own understanding of that past therefore becomes.
Thank you, Anirudh, and so that was lovely, a long, and of course very clear, definitive answer. So now, as a chair, I'm opening this door for questions. And here, Anirudh, so here it is, that that I think the seminar committee members will be reading out this question, coming in the chat box, and you will be attending to them. Okay. So yeah.
Sure, sir. I'll take
open
over.
for questions. Yeah. Thank you.
So we are getting questions from Facebook and from people in this Zoom call right now. First of all, Professor Herbans Mukhya has made a comment regarding the talk. He writes on Facebook that, "Thank you, Anirudh, for a superb talk. Just a minor revision. Peasant propertiers in medieval India are not zamindars. They are rayat and khudkash. Zamindars have superior rights in land, that is the right to collect revenue from the rayat, as also jagirdars. But jagirdars are transferred regularly, but zamindars are not state officials and are not transferable. But you are right, 1793 changed the nature of zamindari." Another question from...
when I said peasant proprietor, I said actually the colonial India. In colonial India, peasant proprietors, they are also categorized in North India and Northwest India as zamindars, which are different from the zamindars of Bengal.
Sure, sir.
Yeah, okay.
Another question from Facebook we can take, and then we can perhaps ask the people in the group to ask their questions on their own if they wish to. Another question is by Manimugh Sharma. Manimugh Sharma, he asks, "Great lecture, Anirudh sir. I have a question. The weekend historians have managed to convey an idea rather forcefully that the Marathas were in modern terms, and were the true patriots who understood India in modern terms and defended Hindus from Muslim aggression. Academics know this to be bunkum, but how can this distortion of the past be effectively challenged? These days, the weekend historian brigade are claiming that India always had a civilizational nationalism."
Well, the only way to, I mean, in my view, I would only, tell Manimugh, who's himself written a book on, Akbar Badshah, that the only way to challenge these weekend historians who are being paraded by, media personalities as great historians of India today, the only way to do that is to continuously reinterpret the sources and, as far as possible, bring to light information contained in the primary sources, which flies in the face of these allegations made by these people. Words like civilizational nationalism actually are nonsense, because all civilizations, I mean, in that sense, all civilizations are nations, and then nations, I mean, all nations have been there forever. In which case, why do the nations change? Why do their shapes change? Why do their territories change? And so on and so forth. So, I mean, these are, periodically these guys come up with such such banal nonsense, and they think they are actually, it's like categories which used to be bandied about 30 years ago, things like, integral humanism, which actually means nothing. So you have, I mean, you really have to, all civilizations are there. So all civilizations are, that way Indian nationalism there during the Harappan times? And then what happened to this nationalism once the Harappans declined? Then suddenly the Aryans came. Of course, they will not say that the Aryans came because they think that the Aryans came. Aryans actually originated here. I don't know what's so great about being an Aryan. That's again a question which I keep asking myself, because I'm not, I don't consider myself, Aryan or Dravidian or whatever. I mean, we are all mixtures of various sorts of people, which science proves. So, if we were a nation, then why were we divided into more than 400 princely states during the British period? And each state had its own anthem, and each state's anthem valorized the king of that state. I mean, these are all available on the net. You can read the anthems of the Jodhpur state or Alwar state or Bharatpur state, and these are very, very quaint and very funny anthems they used to have, valorizing the kings, Raja Amar Rahe and so on and so forth, and Vikramaditya and all that. So frankly speaking, such concepts should just be ignored, either ignored or they should be dismissed out of hand. This whole notion of civilizational nationalism, this is nothing but nonsense. As Eric Hobsbawm in one of the documentaries made on him makes it very clear, and he says it. I mean, I'm quoting Hobsbawm. Hobsbawm says very clearly, he says, practically everything about nationalist history is wrong. I would like to, I mean, if you really want to know, the correct position on nationalist history, I mean, I'd like to quote George Orwell, for instance. He says very clearly that every nationalist is haunted by the belief that the past can be altered. He spends part of his time in the fantasy world in which things happen as they should, in which, for example, the Spanish Armada was a success or the Russian Revolution was crushed in 1918. And he will transfer fragments of this world to the history books whenever possible. This is George Orwell speaking, I mean, in one of his essays in that volume on truth, which was published in London. So you really have, you really cannot, you cannot be intimidated by these terms. And these terms have to be just dismissed out of hand. I would say this is sheer nonsense. It has no analytical value to it, like a mode of production, for instance, or terms like Sanskritization, for instance, or terms like superiority complex, for instance. These have value in them. These have study in them. These have a certain amount of research behind them. But this whole notion about civilizational nationalism or integral humanism or whatever, these are bunkum terms, and they should be dismissed out of hand. One should not feel apologetic in dismissing such mischievous terms.
All right, sir. Hina Gupta is with us in the group. Hina, would you like to ask your own question or should I read it out?
Yeah. So first of all, it was a very important talk for me also. I work on censorship in colonial Indian theater in my PhD research. And while I was listening to your talk, I was actually struck by this. I mean, I know this is not connected to your talk, but somewhere I found some connection in the sense when you were talking about the vocabularies, how it gets transformed. So my question is that we know that there is a very rich history of Lavani and Tamasha right from 1800s, I think 1840 1940s से लेकर के बहुत ही ज़्यादा लिखा गया है इसके बारे में. The scholarship like Veena Narikal has written a lot. So we see that there is a very rich history of these art forms, but slowly and gradually in the colonial times, like especially in the 19th century, 20th century, these art forms have degraded a lot. They are now called as unrespectable art forms. So how do we actually trace the history of popular theatre in the context of your talk?
Well, I mean, it's a very big question, and unfortunately, I don't think I am, intellectually and otherwise equipped to handle this question. I wish Prachi Deshpande would be here to be able to answer this question. But Western India and Maharashtra, for instance, has a great tradition of Shahiri Kavan, and the Shayars used to write Shahirs, as they used to be called. They played a very important role in the emergence of social identities, and especially Maratha identity in Maharashtra, as Prachi Deshpande has noted. In fact, during the British period, almost all these people who were performing artists were looked down upon. They were also looked down upon, not only because many of these performing artists came from the lower castes, but they were also looked down upon because they were considered in many ways, especially these, the nuts and the Bahirupiyas and the other people who performed on the streets, and often their performances were satirical and they could be politically critical and so on. They were also seen as threats to the order of that time. And they were part of this roving population which the British wanted to sedentize and so on. So I think gradually Lavani and Tamasha and the other forms are then absorbed into cinema and theater, and then the transformation happens. And now, of course, now they have become, they are part of cultural programs and so on. But now I don't think, there is a reference to, a tamasha group in the Marathi film Pinjara, for instance, a roving tamasha group which goes from village to village, performing tamasha and lavani and so on. But certainly, like with the other roving artists and the other marginal groups in society who used to perform these things, I think the British looked down upon these, and they also saw them as threats to order and possible challenge to authority. And they tried to regulate them, and they also tried to suppress them. But unfortunately, beyond that, I will not be able to say much on this because I do not have an expertise in this matter.
Thank you, sir.
So there are two questions by Karthik Panigrahi. I think he's present in this group. Karthik, would you like to ask the questions yourself?
Yeah, sure. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Good afternoon, sir. Thanks for the talk. It was great listening to it. So, sir, I have two questions. First of all, is the one term which I really found conspicuous in its absence was obviously Swaraj itself, a term which is very much attached to Maratha and Maratha history in itself. Now, how did that term come about, and what does it signify? Is it about political dominion, about expansion, about military success, or is it about freedom? And if it is about freedom, then how do we juxtapose it with the concept of fitna, which is about changing alliances, of rebellion, which and shared sovereignty, which people like Andre Wink have talked about? And if it is about, and how much how much can we trace the history of the term itself by its continual usage, even by nationalist leaders like Tilak, who used Maratha history and the terminologies associated with it for political mobilization itself. Now, he very specifically uses Swaraj, and for him, it carries a different connotation. For Gandhi also, who uses the term Swaraj, that carries a different connotation. So, what's the that's my first question. Second question is obviously that we presently live in times where book reading has sort of been substituted by reading WhatsApp stories on or getting on social media, where history and information at large has become very democratized and very accessible. So I think the greatest danger is obviously about politically motivated histories getting to the people who really don't have the training to understand the political motivation behind it, the layperson. So do you think that during these times of echo chambers of post-truth, the role of the historian is much more pronounced than previous times to be true to his sources, to be true to his craft? So that's all I would like to ask.
Karthik, big question as usual. I'm used to big questions by you, having taught you.
Thank you, sir.
So, and your questions are always difficult to answer. I won't dwell so much on Swarajya because, see, Swarajya can mean many things in Shivaji's times. When Shivaji, I mean, Swarajya is more spoken about in, in the 17th century and early 18th century. And as the 18th century progresses, you hear less and less of this term. And the sources I have read, for instance, the sources I've mentioned in this paper and the sources I have read, the word Swarajya is, either conspicuously absent from these sources, or possibly it appears, it's very scanty, its use. I don't remember the word Swarajya, for instance. I mean, the Panipat campaign of the Marathas is often confounded with another concept called Hindu Padpadshahi. But the word Hindu Padpadshahi is not to be seen. Hindu Padpadshahi is neither present in the Bakhars of the Panipat period, nor in the letters of Antaji Mankeshwar, nor in the Atma Charitra of Nana Fadnavis, nor in the other sources which I have seen. Even, I mean, if the Marathas had tom-tommed the idea of establishing a Hindu Padpadshahi in Delhi upon its conquest from the Mughals in the campaign of 1760-61, then the idea would have gained traction amongst the Jats or, amongst the Rohillas and so on. Everybody would have, common sense dictates, everybody would have come to know that these people are coming from the Deccan to establish a Hindu Padpadshahi and they wish to replace the Mughal emperor with a Hindu Badshah. In which case, I would expect sources in North India to also refer to this particular term, but they don't. Kashi Raj Pandit's eyewitness account of the events surrounding the Panipat battle of 1761 does not mention this term at all, nor does it mention the term Swarajya. Swarajya, simply put, is autonomous rule, self-rule. It can have meanings in terms of, let's say, speaking in a particular language or promoting a different kind of cabinet like the Ashtapradhan of Shivaji. It may or may not have meant an administrative, military, and etymological break from the traditions established in the Deccan by the Deccan Sultanates. And in Shivaji's case, let's say, the Sultanates of the Nizam Shahi and Adil Shahi. Even there, the historians are, divided in their understanding of the Swarajya. Whether this Swarajya is a continuation of several tendencies which are quite strong and noticeable in the Deccan Sultanates of the period, or whether this Swarajya marks a major break from the Sultanates in architecture, in language, in the promotion of Marathi. Of course, we see that there is this promotion of Marathi, and there is some emphasis on development of a Shabdakosh and so on and so forth. But to what extent is difficult to say. And so I think when Tilak or Gandhi uses the word Swarajya, they use it more in terms of autonomy, in terms of self-rule, in terms of being free of outside domination in important cultural, political, linguistic matters. And thereby, they mean an attempt to recover one's self-respect and historical agency. Beyond that, it is very difficult to define this term. This term is very, nobody has actually defined it in the medieval period. We don't really know. Shivaji speaks of, Swarajya, and that means self-rule, that means autonomous rule. That does not mean a modern nation state.
Also, sir, adding to my second question, I would say that not only social media, but another thing which really has caught my attention is the proliferation in the number of films we see about Maratha history itself. I mean, looking at the last very few years, you see a lot of films which have come about the subject itself, and that sort of is a very big red flag, because, and that I think also raises the job of a historian much more, because
Of course,
this directly taking history to the doorstep of a layperson who might not appreciate the nuances of sources of different political positions, of complexities of history, and would rather very unwittingly accept that it's a Hindu and Muslim battle. I mean, people are doing that very much, but, and not only that, it's political dog whistling. You see this, and even actors themselves partaking in this. I mean, not only this, apart from this, there is also the term Maratha itself has become so very used. I mean, there was this film which had nothing to do about Maratha history itself. It had Ajay Devgan, of course it had, and there he said, "मैं मराठा हूँ, मैं जान भी दे दूंगा, मैं ये भी कर दूंगा." I mean, the term itself has become completely different. If you look at it, the term Maratha itself has become catch-all term for everything national today, anything Indian, anything not foreign today. That sort of thing is something which raises your eyebrow.
So, Karthik, this is all nationalist ideology, jingoism, shrillness of categories, and of course, Bollywood always steps in to make money from all these things. So they swim with the tide. And not that, I mean, it's never known to produce critical historical films. Most of the historical films produced by Bollywood are, nationalist nonsense, totally at variance with truth and what is contained in the sources. In fact, as my very good friend Shraddha Kumbhojkar has recently pointed out on YouTube, she has an entire program on Bajirao Mastani, this very glamorous historical produced by Bollywood some years ago, and she has a delightful program on this YouTube program. You can check it out, in which she, it's, of course, the program is in Marathi, but you can actually get the drift of what she's saying, in which she takes the film apart completely, deconstructs it. And the kind of ridiculous things which these people are doing, for instance, borrowing the British coat of arms and then, showing this coat of arms as the coat of arms of Bajirao. In any other country, of course, here anything goes. Tomorrow you can show anything. You can, and helmets designed after the Roman fashion, and people on simple duty wearing armor. I mean, people just don't roam around wearing armor. You see, armor is something which you wear when the battle is about to commence. You don't waste your energy roaming around, wearing a 8 kilo, 7 kilo or 10 kilo armor and roaming around like a messenger and, strutting about in a studio. The height of foolishness. These are, stupid films. But unfortunately, stupid films are being made for stupid people. And, as Satyajit Ray very clearly said once, that the Indian audience is very backward and it is historically ill-informed. So the people enjoy it. Let the Charana crowd enjoy it, and let those who write and read and, make films for this Charana crowd, they keep making money out of all these things. So this has nothing to do with history. Of course, unfortunately, the historical sensibilities of people get corrupted as a consequence of that. But then the historian, almost in all societies, I mean, India is not the only society where this happens. Of course, abroad, things are slightly different because there is a civil society and a different point of view is heard. And, and I think the number of audiences who go to cinema theaters to lap up all sorts of things is slightly lesser than the number of people here. So what can the historian pretty much do about this? See, if people don't read, the historian cannot go to people's houses with his books and ask people to read his books. The historian can become a public historian in the sense he can intervene, write articles, and good historians are doing that. It is not as if historians don't write in alternate media and mainstream media and and newspapers and magazines and so on. But what else can you do? Because see, Indian filmmakers, if you see, I've just written a paper on war cinema in India for a seminar which was conducted in Jindal University some 2 or 3 months ago. And this paper will be part of the collection of articles which they will publish in the seminar magazine. And while visually researching cinema for this paper, I came to the conclusion that, except a couple of films, in about 70, 80 years of its existence, Hindi cinema has not produced a critical war movie, a single critical war movie, or a war movie critical of the armed forces. It is impossible to do so. And similarly, there are shibboleths in history which you cannot touch. There are holy cows in history which you cannot touch, because, if you dare to speak the truth, or if you dare to give out your interpretation, then, you very well know what the consequences will be. So as far as this audiovisual media is concerned, television is concerned, and cinema is concerned, but for rare exceptions, which might now meet with censorship and worse, it's impossible to broach a subject critically.
Yes, sir. Apparently, I was reading this, story. Yesterday only. I remember there was this movie Onir wanted to make on a gay man in the Indian Army, and he wasn't allowed to do so because now you require a clearance from the Defense Ministry to make a movie in the Indian Army.
How can there be gay men in the Indian Army? Are you joking? This is apostasy. How can there be? Indian Army does not have gay men. I'm sorry, you're wrong.
Are there more questions from people among this group? There is one comment on Facebook. May I read that out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sushant Mishra on Facebook has written, problem with Professor Anirudh's hypothesis is that he is mixing two periods in his study. If Mulk and Desh terms were used in 17th, 18th century having their own historical context, then Rashtra, Rashtravad / nationalism was the reality of 19th, 20th century having their own historical challenges and context.
No, I don't understand the question.
Are there any other questions from people within this group?
The idea was to convey the point that words remain the same but their meanings change. That was the idea. So, you know, Watan, when used in a Bollywood song, is very different from, let's say, the Watan Jagir in medieval Deccan. That Watan is very different. So if you start confounding the meaning of Watan as it is found in a Bollywood song or in a nationalist poem, and then imputing and transferring that meaning to the 18th century source in which the word Watan is using, then you will actually end up, you know, confounding history further. As it is, the notion of history in this country is confounded. So you'll actually, get more mixed up with the category. Similarly, mulk, for instance. So my essential point was anachronism happens simply because words remain the same. People use the same words, but they impute new meanings to these words. Why I refer to the word villain? The word villain is very interesting, for instance. So the word villain comes from, it actually in the medieval times, the word villain actually refers to a peasant, a laborer, a worker, basically. There is no essentially negative connotation attached to this word villain. But we see by the end of the 19th century and in the 20th century, the word villain starts appearing in a different context altogether. Mark Bloch draws our attention to this change of meaning. A word which may refer to an agricultural laborer in a particular context may become a word for a peasant in another context, and it becomes a negative sort of person, a villain, in modern novels and in cinema and so on. So etymology is itself a very interesting subject. Where words originate, what do they mean initially? How do the meanings of these words change over time? And how they creep into the language of the historian, who sometimes uses these words without reflecting on them. That's why I emphasized the concept of self-reflexivity. The historian must step back from his interpretations, his language, reread his stuff, and interrogate that stuff once again. Be self-reflexive. But the problem with an very strong ideological position taken by a historian who is partisan and who is motivated is that, once he takes that position in a very strong fashion, then sometimes it becomes a problem. It becomes an ego issue with that historian. He will then try to stand by and defend that position. And the more mischievous a historian is, the more he confines his practice to the weekends, and the more the more ill-intentioned his history writing is, the greater the chances of anachronism creeping into historical discourses. And that is the problem. It has become far more acute now. It's always been there, but it has become far more acute now in the times in which we live, because everybody thinks only in binaries, in polar opposites.
Thank you, sir. I don't think we have any more comments or questions. And with the permission of the chair, I would ask, should we conclude the talk?
Yes, please. Do. Thank you.
I thank Professor Deshpande for this extremely interesting talk. And I thank everyone who joined us through Zoom, through Facebook and YouTube. And we expect to have you with us in the upcoming talks over this whole semester. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to share, these views, which are obviously in their infancy, with the seminar committee members as well as all the participants who were there and who listened to me very patiently. Thank you very much once again. And thanks to the chair for his kind words.
Thank you, Anirudh.
Thank you. So should we exit?
I think so.
Yes, sir.